The estate agent's email arrived at precisely 11:42 a.m. on a crisp September morning, but what appeared in Angela Rayner's inbox wasn't simply another routine property update. Nobody could have possibly anticipated that within 72 hours, Britain's Deputy Prime Minister would be forced to resign in absolute disgrace, triggering the most devastating political earthquake of Keir Starmer's increasingly embattled premiership. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment when a politician who built her entire career systematically attacking others for tax avoidance gets spectacularly caught doing precisely the same thing on an even grander scale? That's exactly what transpired when Angela Rayner's £40,000 stamp duty scandal exploded into public view, destroying not only her own political future, but potentially bringing down the entire Labour government in the most humiliating fashion imaginable. It all began 18 months earlier in the prosperous seaside town of Hove, where Angela Rayner had fallen absolutely head over heels in love with an 800-pound accountant overlooking the magnificent English Channel. The Deputy Prime Minister, who had spent years ruthlessly denouncing Conservative politicians as scum for their sophisticated tax arrangements, was about to embark on her own, rather creative and potentially legally questionable interpretation of Britain's complex property tax laws. What she didn't realize was that her elaborate financial maneuvering would eventually unravel in the most publicly humiliating fashion imaginable, destroying not only her own career, but potentially toppling the entire Labour government. But here's what you haven't heard yet about the genuinely shocking origins of Rayner's spectacular downfall. The property purchase wasn't a simple case of upgrading to a nicer home. It was part of an extraordinarily elaborate trust arrangement designed to provide financial security for her disabled son, whilst simultaneously and quite deliberately minimizing her substantial tax liability. In January 2025, Rayner had sold her stake in the family home in Ashton-under-Lyne to a specially created trust, strategically using the proceeds to purchase the luxury Hove apartment several months later. The transaction was precisely the kind of sophisticated financial engineering that Rayner had spent years vehemently condemning when employed by wealthy Conservative politicians. Yet here she was, a working-class MP who prided herself on authenticity and straight-talking, engaging in exactly the same morally questionable behavior she had branded as sleazy and corrupt when others had the audacity to do it. Now here's where you need to understand why Rayner's hypocrisy was so perfectly designed to destroy her political credibility in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. This wasn't simply a case of making an honest mistake about genuinely complex tax rules. It was a fundamental betrayal of absolutely everything she claimed to represent throughout her entire political career. For years, Rayner had positioned herself as the relentless scourge of Conservative tax avoiders, the authentic voice of working-class Britain, who would never ever stoop to the financial games played by privileged Tories. Her most famous and devastating attack had come in 2018, when she accused then Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt of sleaze for using what she termed a Tory tax loophole to save nearly £100 in stamp duty when purchasing 7 luxury apartments. "These people are scum," she had declared, her voice absolutely dripping with moral indignation and righteous fury. "They think the rules don't apply to them, that they can dodge taxes whilst ordinary working families pay every single penny they earn." The irony was devastating and politically lethal in the most comprehensive way possible. The woman who had made her entire reputation systematically attacking others for sophisticated tax arrangements had herself engaged in precisely the same behavior, but on an even more elaborate scale. Worse still, she had done so whilst serving as Housing Secretary, the very minister directly responsible for property taxation policy across the entire country. It was hypocrisy of such breathtaking proportions that even her most loyal supporters struggled desperately to defend her conduct. The scandal first broke with devastating impact on September 1, 2025, when investigative journalists from The Times revealed intricate details of Rayner's questionable property transaction. The initial reporting was carefully worded and meticulously researched, noting significant discrepancies between Rayner's claimed primary residence and her actual living arrangement. But within mere hours, the story had exploded into a full-blown political crisis of unprecedented magnitude as the true extent of her elaborate financial maneuvering became glaringly apparent to the entire nation. The technical details of Rayner's sophisticated tax avoidance scheme were genuinely complex and deliberately obfuscated, but the political implications were devastatingly simple and impossible to ignore. By claiming that her Ashton-under-Lyne property remained her primary residence despite selling her stake to a specially created trust, she had avoided paying the higher rate of stamp duty that legally applies to second home. The carefully orchestrated maneuver had saved her £40,000, exactly the kind of substantial sum that makes front-page headlines and destroys political careers overnight. But here's what made Rayner's position completely and utterly untenable: her immediate defensive response when first confronted with the serious allegation. Rather than acknowledging the obvious mistake and taking full responsibility like an honorable politician should, she initially claimed that she had acted entirely on professional legal advice and done absolutely nothing. It was precisely the kind of defensive, evasive response she had mercilessly condemned when conservative politicians made identical arguments about their own questionable tax affairs. The political establishment's reaction was swift and merciless. Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch immediately demanded Rayner's resignation, describing her position as untenable, given her history of attacking others for identical behavior. You cannot spend years calling people scum for tax arrangements, and then engage in exactly the same conduct yourself, Badenoch declared during Prime Minister's questions. It's rank hypocrisy of the most contemptible kind. Even more damaging was the response from within Rayner's own party. Labour MPs who had previously supported her began privately expressing doubts about her continued viability as Deputy Prime Minister. The backbench rebellion that had been simmering over other issues suddenly found its perfect focus in Rayner's blatant hypocrisy over tax avoidance. The constitutional implications of the scandal extended far beyond Rayner's personal fate. As Deputy Prime Minister and Housing Secretary, she had been responsible for policies affecting millions of property owners across Britain. Her own tax avoidance, whilst simultaneously imposing higher taxes on others, raised serious questions about the integrity of the entire government's approach to property taxation. Trade unions, traditionally Rayner's strongest supporters, found themselves in an impossible position. How could they defend a minister who had avoided paying her fair share of taxes whilst their members faced increasing tax burdens and reduced public services? Unite, the union that had backed Rayner's rise through Labour's ranks, notably failed to issue any statement of support when the scandal broke. The media response was particularly brutal because it highlighted the sheer scale of Rayner's hypocrisy. Every major newspaper published side-by-side comparisons of her previous attacks on conservative tax avoiders with details of her own arrangements. The visual impact was devastating. Here was a politician who had built her entire brand on moral superiority being exposed as a fraud. 3 days after the initial revelations, Rayner was forced to admit that she had indeed made a mistake in her tax arrangements. The admission came during a tear-filled interview with Sky News, where she appeared to be on the verge of emotional collapse. "I'm devastated because I've always upheld the rules and always have done," she claimed, seemingly oblivious to the irony of her statement. But hang on. You haven't heard about the devastating response from her former victims yet. Jeremy Hunt, the conservative politician she had attacked in 2018, issued a statement that perfectly captured the political mood. "Angela Rayner spent years calling me scum for following legal tax advice. Now we discover she's been doing exactly the same thing whilst serving as a government minister." The hypocrisy is absolutely staggering. The response from other conservative politicians was equally damaging. Nadeem Zahawi, the former chancellor, whom Rayner had also attacked over tax affairs, noted that he had resigned immediately when questions arose about his arrangements. "I did the honourable thing and stepped down," he observed. Will Angela Rayner show the same integrity she demanded from others? But the most psychologically devastating blow came from an unexpected source: working-class voters in Rayner's own constituency. The people she claimed to represent began expressing feelings of betrayal that their champion had been engaging in exactly the same behavior she condemned in others. "She's no different from the rest of them," one local resident told BBC reporters. "All politicians are the same. They say one thing and do another." The constitutional crisis deepened when Rayner referred herself to Sir Laurie Magnus, the government's independent advisor on ministerial standards. It was an acknowledgement that her position was becoming untenable, but it also created a ticking time bomb for Starmer's government. If Magnus found that she had breached the ministerial code, her resignation would become inevitable. Keir Starmer's response to the crisis revealed the weakness of his political position. Initially, he offered Rayner his full support, claiming that she had gone over and above transparency requirements. But as the scandal intensified and more details emerged, his support became increasingly half-hearted. By the end of the week, Downing Street sources were briefing that the Prime Minister was deeply disappointed by Rayner's conduct. The opposition parties sensed blood in the water and moved to maximise the damage to Labour's credibility. Nigel Farage's Reform UK party, already surging in the polls, seized on the scandal as evidence of Labour's fundamental dishonesty. "They promised us a new kind of politics," Farage declared at a party rally. "Instead, we got the same old corruption, the same old hypocrisy, the same old lie." The Liberal Democrats, traditionally more restrained in their political attacks, were equally scathing. Leader Ed Davey noted that Rayner's behaviour perfectly exemplified everything that was wrong with modern politics. She built her career attacking others for doing exactly what she was doing herself. It's the kind of rank hypocrisy that destroys public trust in democratic institutions. The international reaction was equally damaging to Britain's reputation. European political commentators noted that the scandal highlighted the instability of Starmer's government just 18 months after its landslide election victory. American observers compared the situation to similar political scandals that had brought down governments in other democracies. Friday, September 5, 2025, will be remembered as the day Angela Rayner's political career effectively ended. Sir Laurie Magnus delivered his report on her conduct, finding that whilst she had acted with integrity and with a dedicated and exemplary commitment to public service, she had nonetheless breached the Ministerial Code by failing to seek appropriate tax advice for her complex arrangement. The report's language was diplomatic, but its conclusion was devastating. Magnus found that Rayner's failure to heed warnings in her legal advice to seek expert guidance on her complicated financial situation constituted a breach of the standards expected of government ministers. It is with deep regret that I must advise you that in these circumstances, I consider the code to have been breached, he wrote. Rayner's resignation letter was a masterpiece of political damage limitation that fooled absolutely nobody. She claimed to take full responsibility for her error, whilst simultaneously suggesting that the real problem was the complexity of the tax system rather than her own conduct. I deeply regret my decision to not seek additional specialist tax advice, she wrote, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of the hypocrisy that had made her position untenable. Starmer's response to her resignation revealed the extent of the political damage. His letter accepting her resignation was notably cool, lacking the warmth typically shown to departing colleagues. Whilst he praised her dedicated service, he conspicuously failed to defend her conduct or express regret at her departure. It was the kind of formal response reserved for ministers who had become political liabilities. The immediate political consequences were severe and far-reaching. Starmer was forced to conduct a major cabinet reshuffle to fill the void left by Rayner's departure. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, was moved to become Deputy Prime Minister, whilst Fated Cooper took over at the Foreign Office. The musical chairs demonstrated the extent to which Rayner's resignation had destabilized the entire government structure. But the longer-term damage to Labour's credibility was even more severe. The party that had promised to restore integrity to politics had been exposed as hypocritical and dishonest. Rayner's fall from grace became a perfect metaphor for everything the public disliked about modern politicians: the gap between rhetoric and reality, the rules for thee but not for me mentality that poisoned democratic discourse. The polling response was immediate and catastrophic for Labour. Within a week of Rayner's resignation, the party had fallen to third place in national polling, behind both Reform UK and the Conservative. Starmer's personal approval ratings collapsed to historic lows, with even Labour voters expressing disgust at the hypocrisy displayed by their own politicians. Reform UK's Nigel Farage seized the moment brilliantly, bringing forward his conference speech to capitalise on Labour's disarray. The Labour government is in deep crisis, he declared to thunderous applause. They promised us honesty and gave us hypocrisy. They promised us integrity and gave us corruption. They promised us change and gave us more of the same. The constitutional implications of Rayner's fall extended far beyond immediate political damage. Her case established a new precedent that ministers who engaged in tax avoidance whilst criticising others for similar conduct would face immediate and overwhelming pressure to resign. It was a victory for accountability, but it also highlighted how shallow Labour's commitment to integrity had been. The business community's response was particularly damaging to Labour's economic credibility. If the Deputy Prime Minister couldn't be trusted to pay her own taxes properly, how could businesses trust the government to implement fair and consistent tax policies? The scandal reinforced perceptions that Labour politicians were fundamentally dishonest about financial matters. The trade union movement's reaction was equally devastating for Labour's traditional coalition. Union leaders who had previously supported Rayner found themselves unable to defend someone who had avoided paying her fair share whilst their members faced increasing tax burden. The scandal accelerated the growing disconnect between Labour's political leadership and its traditional working-class base. Most personally devastating for Rayner was the response from her own constituency. The working-class voters of Ashton-under-Lyne had seen her as their champion, someone who would fight against the privileged elite on their behalf. Her exposure as a tax avoider destroyed that narrative completely, leaving her politically isolated and without a natural base of support. The media's coverage of Rayner's downfall was particularly brutal because it highlighted the systematic nature of her hypocrisy. Every major newspaper published detailed timelines showing her attacks on conservative tax avoiders alongside her own arrangement. The visual evidence of her double standards was overwhelming and politically lethal. 3 months after her resignation, the full extent of Rayner's political miscalculation became apparent. Opinion polling showed that her scandal had been a crucial factor in Labour's collapse in the poll. The party that had won a landslide election victory was now facing the prospect of losing power at the next election, largely due to perceptions of hypocrisy and dishonesty stemming from Rayner's conduct. The constitutional precedent established by Rayner's fall was profound and lasting. Future politicians would understand that the do as I say, not as I do approach to public life was no longer sustainable. The public's tolerance for political hypocrisy had reached its limit, and careers could be destroyed instantly when the gap between rhetoric and reality became too obvious to ignore. 6 months later, Angela Rayner announced that she would not seek re-election to Parliament, effectively ending her political career. The woman who had once been tipped as a future Labour leader had been destroyed by her own hypocrisy, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of political double standards in the social media age. The international academic community began studying Rayner's downfall as a perfect example of how political hypocrisy could destroy careers in the modern democratic environment. Her case was taught in political science courses as an illustration of why consistency between public positions and private conduct was essential for political survival. The long-term damage to Starmer's government proved irreversible. Rayner's scandal had exposed fundamental problems with Labour's approach to integrity and accountability. The party that had promised to restore trust in politics had shown itself to be just as dishonest and hypocritical as its predecessor. The economic implications of the scandal extended beyond immediate political damage. International investors began questioning whether a government that couldn't maintain basic standards of ministerial conduct could be trusted to implement consistent economic policy. The pound weakened against major currencies as confidence in British political institutions declined. Today, political historians consider Angela Rayner's tax scandal as a watershed moment in British politics. It marked the end of the era when politicians could attack others for conduct they engaged in themselves. The public's demand for consistency between rhetoric and reality had finally overcome the traditional tolerance for political hypocrisy. The lesson of Rayner's downfall extends beyond British politics to democratic societies worldwide. In an age of social media and instant communication, political hypocrisy can be exposed and punished more quickly than ever before. Politicians who build their careers on moral superiority whilst engaging in questionable conduct themselves do so at their own peril. Angela Rayner's political obituary was written not by her opponents, but by her own work. The woman who called others scum for tax avoidance whilst engaging in the same behavior herself learned that in modern politics, hypocrisy is the one sin that cannot be forgiven. Her fall from grace serves as a permanent reminder that integrity is not optional for political leaders. It's the foundation upon which democratic legitimacy rests. The aftermath of Rayner's resignation proved even more politically devastating than the initial scandal itself. Within weeks of her departure, leaked internal Labour documents revealed the extraordinary extent to which senior party figures had known about potential problems with her tax arrangements, but had chosen to remain silent. Treasury officials had reportedly raised concerns about the propriety of her financial structures as early as March 2025. But these warnings had been systematically ignored by Downing Street. Most embarrassingly for the entire Labour leadership, the leaked documents showed that Starmer himself had been briefed about potential issues with Rayner's arrangements in a confidential memo from the Cabinet Secretary. The Prime Minister had apparently dismissed these concerns as political interference rather than legitimate governance issues, revealing his cavalier attitude toward the ethical standards he claimed to champion. The international reaction to Rayner's downfall provided another devastating blow to Britain's already fragile reputation for political stability. Former European Commission officials publicly questioned whether the UK possessed the institutional integrity necessary for serious international partnerships. The spectacle of a deputy prime minister resigning over tax avoidance whilst simultaneously implementing austerity measures was seen across Europe as evidence of British political dysfunction. The constitutional implications of the scandal established new precedents that would constrain future governments of any political persuasion. Legal experts noted that Rayner's case had effectively created a new category of ministerial misconduct, hypocritical breach of public trust, that would make it impossible for politicians to survive scandals involving conduct they had previously condemned in other. Perhaps most significantly, the scandal accelerated the broader realignment of British politics that had been developing since Brexit. Traditional class-based loyalties continued to erode as working-class voters increasingly abandoned politicians who preached one set of values whilst practicing another. Rayner's fall symbolized the complete breakdown of trust between Labour's leadership and its historical base, opening the door for populist alternatives like Reform UK. The long-term economic consequences of the political instability triggered by Rayner's resignation, extended far beyond immediate market reaction. International credit rating agencies began factoring political hypocrisy and governmental instability into their assessments of British sovereign debt, leading to increased borrowing costs that would burden taxpayers for years to come. 2 years after her resignation, when academic studies analysed the collapse of public trust in British institutions, Rayner's tax scandal was consistently identified as a crucial turning point. Her case had demonstrated that in the social media age, political hypocrisy could be exposed and punished more rapidly and comprehensively than ever before, fundamentally altering the relationship between political rhetoric and personal conduct. Subscribe to the channel if you want to know how hypocrisy destroys political careers, because what you witnessed wasn't simply a story about tax avoidance. It was a story about how democratic societies eventually punish politicians who say one thing and do another, and how sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is simply exposing the truth.